Hey guys, Dave Jaden here with Wood Slabs and AdvantageLumber.com. Today we're going to be talking about seal coats. Now seal coats are what you do before you do an actual flood coat to prevent any porous wood from aerating into your epoxy. We're taking some 320 on a pad and going back and forth with the grain. What it does is it kind of helps get some of those light swirl marks out left over from 220 on the orbitals. What we're doing is just working our way down the slab, making sure we get all those little marks out. We like the 320 with the foam backers because that helps prevent you from creating any hot spots with your hand that can cause some burnish marks or any slight divots. The foam just kind of eases into the form of your hand and helps make it a nice and smooth surface for the epoxy to adhere to. Once you think you're done sanding, don't forget to take a tack cloth and pull off any residual dust. You don't want that mixing in with the epoxy. That could potentially cloud that up a little bit. Now when doing the flood coat, we usually start with the part B as it's a little bit thinner and doesn't stick to the walls as much. The thicker part A, what will happen is when you do that first and then you pour your part B into it, the part A will kind of stick to the walls and you'll have to really scrape it out of there. If too much sticks to the walls, it'll kind of throw your ratio off enough to notice. As you can see, as we're pouring it in there, it's definitely noticeably thicker. You don't want to really put that in first to have it stick to the side walls because you could actually screw up your ratio that way. You can either mix with a drill or mix by hand. Now when you're mixing by hand, you want to definitely pay attention and try to scrape as much off the sides as possible. You can see as the two parts are getting mixed up, it actually becomes cloudy. That's a sign that you need to keep mixing. When it starts getting thoroughly mixed, you'll watch the clarity begin to come back. Any air that you see trapped in there isn't so much a worry on these flood coats or seal coats because it's a thin layer. Another trick is to pour that out into a clean bucket. All the stuff that's stuck to the sidewalls is going to stay in the first bucket and only the mixed product is going to end up in the second bucket. This is just another step to ensure that your two parts are actually equally mixed. It's also not a bad idea to go ahead and give that second bucket a twirl at this time. Now because it's just a seal coat, we don't actually need to mix up a lot of resin. You know, a table of this size, generally I would estimate 2 to 3 gallons to get a good flood coat on it. Now on this, we're just doing a seal coat. We're just spreading a small amount of epoxy over the whole surface and we're going to smooth that over with a squeegee. All we're trying to do is help seal up any of the surface pores and it helps fair everything out. If you got slight difference from the sanders, this definitely helps ease those out. Now when we're doing seal coats, it's not so much as trying to get a good solid layer over the whole thing as a thin coat that's going to sink into the surface of the wood. Now as we're only sanding to 220, then by hand with 320, we're not clearing the epoxy back up all the way, and that's okay. Because when you put your finish on, that's going to fall into those micro scratches and bring that back out. Application is best done with just a basic squeegee, whatever, just spread it around and let soak into the wood. You can see in certain areas where she went over, it's already starting to dry out. So what you want to do is as you're pushing it around, just say, oh, I missed a little spot over here or it's absorbing a little bit too much. Push that product back over and it's going to help fill in those areas. Now is a good time to mention that we're using Wisebond brand epoxy, specifically the Wisebond bar and tabletop epoxy, while the River was done with the Wisebond deep pour resin. Now we're not quite trying to push this over the edge just yet because what we're going to want to do is going to be pre-priming the edge. You can see that they're just dipping their hand in there and then just smearing that along the edge. What that does is it breaks the surface tension. When you break the surface tension, it allows the epoxy to roll over in a smooth coat. If you try to push the epoxy over the edge without that, it's going to come off in drips and not really lay evenly. Look at that action as it rolls right off the edge. It's coming off in a smooth curtain. There's no drips, there's no surface tension stopping it from reacting the way it should. Now you can see in the bottom left part of the table there that it's looking a little dry in certain spots, and you're going to see us move that back over to help fill in those dry spots. The goal with these seal coats is to have a thin layer of epoxy inside the surface of the wood. That helps your flood coat lay perfectly flat to the point that when you're spreading around, it's almost beating off the surface. You can see how he just pointed out a dry spot near him and he's pulling some excess product over to that area to help sink in. When you think you're done spreading that epoxy around to all those dry spots, thoroughly checking to make sure there's not any that you're missing because that could cause some issues later, go ahead and take that spreader and push all that excess epoxy off the table, preferably into a bucket, which is going to help save a mess later. And if you got a second project that you're working on at the same time, it allows you to recycle that product and go straight into the next one as long as you're within that working time advertised on the bottle. Now the reason that you do this is because you don't want to leave any high spots, because you're going to be leveling this back out at 220. Any high spots with the epoxy or excess, you're just going to have to spend excess time on and more paper to get that off. Now as you're doing this, you might notice some spots are starting to bubble up a little bit, and that's okay. That's exactly what you want to happen. You want the epoxy to be falling into those pores and the air to be coming out. When the bubble comes to the surface, you just take your blowtorch in a sweeping motion and go right over that. Now with that blowtorch, it's just a fast sweeping motion. You don't want to heat up the resin, you just want the heat and pressure to pop those bubbles. You don't want a bubble to form, because if that bubble forms, it stops the epoxy from falling into the wood. Now if you don't have a blowtorch, a heat gun works just fine on most resins. Now look at that clarity. Epoxy is one of the best products to be bringing out perfect clarity on these river tables. Now there's nothing wrong with putting a polyurethane, a lacquer, or varnish, but a lot of those tend to have flattening agents that you can see in a light film on top of the resin. When you do the epoxy, it's a clear transition from the finish right into the river. Now the seal coat's complete, so we got to wait about 24 hours until we can sand that down. What we're going to do is we're going to sand that down with some 220 grit on an orbital sander. We want to keep that sander nice and flat. You do not want to dig any divots. You just want to level the surface back out. Sometimes it only takes one seal coat before you can do your flood coat. Sometimes it could take 2 or 3 depending on the wood. Different species are going to react differently and let out different amounts of air. Thank you guys for watching. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, follow, and share us on all your social media platforms. And we'll see you next time.